Suggestions that you guys brought up last week. I thought it'd be very helpful if we actually got to run through something that seemed very boring and dry. I promise not every week will be like this, partly because it took me 3 hours to prepare this, and I don't really want to do that again. But this is stuff that I wish I had known when I was a little younger, so I actually could have had some context for where everything's happening, especially in the Old Testament, because the books in that part of the Bible are like all over the place. You don't actually even have them in order for some of it. So I'm going to go through this a bit at a time. So the first quote I should bring up, because this is going to come up with the years a lot. I'll try not to get too much into dates because I'm not testing you guys or anything. So actually remembering the dates is not fully important. It's more just a point of interest. Who here knows what the terminology for BC and AD stands for? Stephen, I saw your hand up first.
Yeah. BC was before Christ and AD was after David.
What was that? What did you say for the second one?
Before Christ and after David.
Almost correct. Now a lot of people think that after death meant AD meant after death, meaning after Jesus died. Not actually correct, because if you think about that before, Christ, means, yeah, I know that. That's also not correct, because that would actually leave about 1,000 years unaccounted for. A lot of people think it's before Christ and after death, meaning before Jesus was born and after he died. That kind of leaves 30 years unaccounted for too. AD actually stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for the year of our Lord. So it actually is a shift from when Jesus was born to after he was born. Technically speaking, that's also not correct, because when they actually developed that calendar, they actually have since decided that Jesus was probably born between 6 and 4 BC. Of course, with BC, the time counts up, not down. They obviously didn't think that way at the time. That was that big. The early Catholic Church came up with that. I recognize that's confusing. People that study it nowadays actually don't even call it by that anymore. They say BCE and CE for before Common Era and Common Era, because not everyone's Christian, so of course they had to account for that. But it's still basically the same thing. It's before and after Jesus is born, roughly speaking. And for point of reference, Jesus, they think, was about 36 when he died. So you could figure on, after the crucifixion being about 33 CE. And the first of the Gospels we have, they think Mark was probably the first one written. So that was around 70 CE, which is also when the Romans burned the Second Temple, when Israel, as we knew it at the time, pretty much ceased to be. All the Gospels, pretty much every book in the New Testament would have been written before the year 100. So we have that going for the history. I'm going to be focusing more on the Old Testament stuff tonight, because I think that's where more of the confusion comes in, especially since the New Testament takes place all within about a generation. There's really less history to talk about there. Plus, we have better documentation of that, so there's less controversy over it. So,
Jeffrey, why don't you take your mask down? You might.
Oh, the camera is running.
No.
It's not
on you.
Oh.
It's on the screen.
All right, so for the early history in the book of Genesis, obviously coming first. So the big question with that is, when did everything actually start? You have a lot of theories revolving around that. I am not going to try to answer that, because that's probably one of the most controversial questions that's ever existed. Basically, the two prevailing theories is that the Earth is either about 6,000 years old, or just the young Earth theory in general, that Earth is only several thousand years old. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with thinking that the Earth is that young. I would question this whole 6,000 year thing, because that was just some random theory that an Irish archbishop came up with about 300 years ago. I don't think there's really any evidence to suggest that that's true at all. Of course, obviously, I'm sure all of you know about the Big Bang stuff, how they say that the universe itself is actually about 4-point-something billion years old. I don't think that necessarily contradicts the Bible either. We have in 2 Peter 3:8, a day is like 1,000 days, and 1,000 years is a day to God. God is outside of time, beyond time. He's obviously beyond our understanding. There's no reason to think the 6 days of creation we read about in Genesis necessarily means that the creation actually took place over 6 days. But really, none of that's really all that important anyway. The important thing to take away from Genesis is God did create the earth. He did it, just by the power of speaking it into existence. That's really all there is to know with that. It's not a salvation issue, all the particulars of what happened when. The important thing is just knowing God has that power, and that eventually Jesus saved us from our sins anyway. That's really all that's important there. I'm going to probably be going somewhat fast here, just so we can get through everything. If you need me to stop for anything or any questions whatsoever, just feel free to interrupt me at any time. I have no problem answering anything. Are there any questions yet? Just checking. Let's see here. Talk about that. All right. So for like the first probably dozen or so chapters of Genesis, we don't really have dates on anything, and no real way of knowing when any of that stuff is taking place. So really, you figure everything up till the end of all that's discussed about Noah, the flood, and the repopulation of the earth after that, we don't really have any point of reference for when any of that took place. If we are looking at it from the whole young earth theory, you figured out was probably about between 4,000 BC, between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, basically. It probably was longer than that from any other point of view, but again, that part's not that important. So then we get to after Noah, where we start getting into the story of Abraham, basically the entire father of the Jewish people, who would have started about right here. We read about how he's in the city of Ur. That's about right there, the northwest part of the Persian Gulf. It's where the modern country of Kuwait is. For point of reference, this right here is modern-day Iraq. That's Iran over here. Israel, this little area over here. Egypt's right there. So on from there. So Abraham, around the age of 70, would have, by God's command, would have left for what was eventually going to become the promised land of Israel, would have followed that red line there. I think if we were to go from here to here, it would be about 200-some miles, but obviously with this path, since he didn't cross straight through the desert, it would have actually probably been longer than that. I'm not positive on the distance. I think it was about 40 years it took him to get there, because obviously he was stopping along the way. Yeah, I'm not going to get into all the stories of what he did. He would have been born sometime between 2300 and 2100 BC. There's a lot of disagreement about that too, because some people, for some reason, get really caught up on whether certain stories of the Bible not only took place earlier, but also were written earlier. I'm not really sure what the compulsion is there, but some people really take offense to any suggestion that anything in the Bible took place later than they suggested. But again, it's not even really that much time, all things considered. It's still roughly 2,000 years ago. 150 years doesn't make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. So he would have gotten over here to what was Canaan at that point in time. The area is settled by one of Noah's descendants, Canaan. Forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. I have a lot of names I'm dealing with here. He got there about at the age of 75, which I think he had Isaac about when he was 100. Am I right on that, Tom?
100 years old, Jeff.
So he would have had his son Isaac, who's also one of the progenitors of the whole Jewish race. So you figure over the next 200 years after that, up to about 1900 BC, that's when you're having all the stories about Isaac, everything. Isaac and Ishmael, the fathers of Judaism and Islam, respectively. Some people consider that a controversial remark, that Ishmael was, the father of the people that would ultimately form the religion of Islam. I don't see why they consider that offensive when I'm pretty sure Islam itself actually affirms that. The whole basis of that religion is that they just think that the descendants of who God promised Abraham were from Ishmael, not Isaac, since Ishmael came first. Then you have the story of Jacob and Esau, who would go on to have his name changed to Israel by God after, the whole Jacob's ladder story, wrestling with the angel after he spent so many years in hiding. Let's see here. And Esau, less remarkably, was supposedly the progenitor of the Hittite people. I don't know a lot about them, but Esau is kind of shown as a bit of an idiot in his stories, so some scholars think that this depiction of that is kind of a subtle jab at those people, which I find kind of funny. And then, of course, after that, you have Isaac's, Jacob, of course, being the father of the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, so that's where you're really starting to get into the actual start of the Jewish people. Specifically, Joseph, who he would have been born, I think, around 1900 BC. Of course, he was, if we remember that story, sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers because they really didn't like him. And then eventually they ended up coming to Egypt too after he kind of took power alongside of Pharaoh after he helped them to overcome the famine there.
Right.
And because of all that, their reconciliation, because there was a famine in Canaan too where they were still settled, they ended up coming to Egypt to live with him. They stayed there for a while. Jacob was in power for about another 80 years. The Israelites, with their families, they multiplied a whole lot. They actually started to outnumber the Egyptians, which is why long after Joseph died, probably about 100 or so years after that, is when the slavery in Egypt began, how we start in Exodus. Let's see here. So from all the figures we have of that, generally we go with 400 years, but with all the controversies about what happened when, you can figure it just being 300 to 500 years the Jews were in captivity in Egypt. Which leads us to about 1500 or so BC. That's when Moses was born. There's controversy on that too for a couple reasons. The two cities that I think are kind of mentioned by name in Exodus in Egypt, the records themselves kind of conflict over when those cities were actually built. Like, supposedly they were built in 1290 BC, which was quite some time after we think Moses was born. But apparently it was common practice amongst the pharaohs that if they improved the city, they just rename it and claim they built it. So, the Exodus could have happened at any time within that period of 150 years. We don't know for certain. It's also because Moses' mother, the woman that took him out of the water in the basket, they're not sure specifically which pharaoh she was related to, so there's that controversy too. I don't know specifically when he killed the Egyptian and had to go into the hiding in Midian, which is about right here on the right side of the Red Sea. But you figure he was there until he also was about 70 years old. So the Bible I have puts that year about 1446 BC is when the Exodus actually happened. When he went back to Egypt, all the 10 plagues happened, all that other business. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, so then we're at the point of the Exodus. Important to note there, we question ourselves a lot. The whole reason the 10 plagues are necessary, Pharaoh having his heart hardened by God after each one said he didn't want to release the Israelites even after everything that was happening. We wonder why that is. It's because after all those things happened, the Egyptians were so desperate to get them out of Egypt at that point, they actually pretty much gave them all the gold they had in Egypt. So the Israelites left Egypt. They started in Egypt basically as slaves, and they left Egypt basically with all of its wealth going with them. Oh wait, I actually have a map of the Exodus itself here. Alright, so I don't think they know for certain where in the Red Sea the Israelites actually crossed in the Exodus. They think it was about right here, I believe, but they disagree with that because some people always thought it was straight through the Red Sea. Some people thought it was a bit higher up here. Again, it doesn't really matter. The geography of the matter doesn't matter. The point is God carried them through the Red Sea. Let's see here. Which, of course, that goes on to when they get to Mount Sinai, they get the Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments. He's up there for about a month talking to God, actually. And Of course, it didn't take the Israelites very long to, after a long time of complaining already, after they literally saw God taking out a whole Egyptian army to protect them, give them bread literally falling from heaven to feed them, apparently that wasn't enough for them. It's almost as soon as Moses goes up this mountain,
Chaos.
they pretty much take all that gold that God sent them out of Egypt with, and they pretty much say, God must not be helping us. Let's make this giant golden idol that we were going to make with our own hands, because at least then we know it's good. They had that kind of attitude going for them. Took the gift literally from God and turned it against them. Moses comes down and sees all this, and we wonder why the Israelites then had to spend 40 years in the desert and all the other hardships they went through. They wondered why. Well, there you go. You really messed up there. You didn't even have the covenant yet, and you already broke it. So then, of course, they're wandering around here for 40-some years before they get to Israel, which part of that's also because the Israelites were too scared to actually go into Israel, which God was really not happy about that, because they see people there that seemed really strong to them. They thought, no, there's no way we can beat them, even though they had this literal strength of God, with them. So that's why they were doing that for so long. It was not arbitrary on God's part. There was a very good reason for it. Let's see here. So, of course, after those 40 years, when that generation was gone through, all the people that refused and died, their children had taken over. They go up to Israel again, or what would become Israel. The Israelites finally get to go into the promised land that God had been promising them ever since the days of Abraham, about nearly 1,000 years earlier. Moses didn't get to go in with them. There's a whole lot of theological reasoning for why. It doesn't matter for the purpose of this lesson. So then Joshua takes over. That's where you start getting the conquest of Israel. Let me get a better map here. So again, the area they're going, they were taking from a lot of different people. You read about this in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges primarily. It was all around here where we know Israel is today. And throughout a lot of the early parts of the Old Testament, we read about all these enemies that the Israelites had that kept giving them trouble through all that time. And the reason for that is because God was telling them to go in this place, and when they defeated a people, they were supposed to kill them all. That sounds harsh, I know, but these were people that were doing very, very evil things within their own religions. Like, these are the kinds of people that, they practiced human sacrifices. I'm pretty sure, rape was basically considered a part of a lot of these religions. Not a very friendly people, especially to outsiders. But the Israelites didn't want to kill all these people, so of course they had to live with that for a while. And a lot of the problems we read about them having in the future was always because they kept getting exposed to these other cultures, these other false idols, that ended up leading them astray. So that was basically why they did that. Every time the Israelites didn't listen to God on the smallest of things, you always see it come back to bite them. You read in the book of Judges, I think 5 or 6 times at least, the specific line, again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of God. So the whole Old Testament, we get the whole time in this book, like, a lot of people somehow read it, and they see God as being this wrathful and angry God. No, like, you get through this whole story, the Israelites messing up time and time again, and even though God had no reason to keep bailing them out and accepting them again as his people, he still does. So, time after time, count probably more than we even have written there. So after they did take all this, actually before I go any further, any questions so far? Anything at all? Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Any other questions?
Well, I was telling Tommy, Joshua said, in my house, we will follow the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the big thing you really see with that whole narrative there, is that the Israelites as a whole were not following God. And some of the social reasons we see with that, this was a time period, pregnancies very often didn't end up working out or even endangered the woman. And a lot of the peoples around them that the Israelites were living among, the false idols that they had, in a lot of cases, were actually related to fertility, to human reproduction. So, of course, when these people felt that God wasn't providing for them as they thought he should, they, of course, would just turn to these they turned to these other idols for help, these idols that had no power, no love for them. They were basically just things made by human hands. And really, there's so much of that, like all those times where the Israelites are turning against God, it's almost always because they were, they were worshiping these false idols belonging to the people around them. And it's actually very fascinating to read about, because their tendency to do this almost ends up reading like they were actually addicted to it, like they literally could not help themselves. As you would think that worshiping another god would probably be the commandment that would be the easiest to follow. Like we all have that compulsion to lie, to be jealous of one another, all those other things we get in the commandments and through all the other moral laws that we get in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. You would think that those would be the things that would mess them up. But no, it was always because they couldn't just keep themselves to worshiping God. It was very interesting to read about. But anyway, at this time, Israel, despite it basically being a kingdom at this point, they didn't have a king. They didn't actually have any real organized leadership outside of their tribal elders and leadership in that way. They were basically living with God as their ultimate leader here. I think the priesthood had a lot more power in this time. But again, with all these times where the Israelites started having a bad time, it's not that God was punishing them, but because they were separating themselves from God's provision, from God's grace, they were, of course, welcoming themselves in the sinful world they lived in to have terrible things happening to them. That's the same thing we live in today. It's not because God punishes us that we have bad things happening to us today. It's because, we're in a world that largely has forgotten God or ignores God. That's why there is still evil in the world, why the world even has evil in it in the first place. But every time God would choose to rescue them, they would call out to God asking for him to send someone to rescue them. So that's where we get the book of Judges, the judges being basically these temporary leaders that God was sending to judge Israel, or basically to lead them out of the hardships that they had at the time, whether it was, some kind of massive pestilence or other calamity or whatever, or the fact that they were being conquered by someone. That's what the judges did. I don't remember exactly how many, somewhere between 6 and 8 of them over about the course of 300 years. That's where we start getting into the period of the kings of Israel, which is about 1000 BC, give or take. Because at this point, the Israelites were so tired of all the times that they were having trouble at this point, that they kept saying to God, give us a king so that we can be like all the great kingdoms around us. God did not want to do this. God didn't even really want to have the covenant that he made with them, in Leviticus, where they were bound by the law. God wanted a relationship with his people that was based on love and unconditional relationship between them. That's all he ever wanted from the creation of man. He didn't want, people that were following him because, they had to. That's why he gave us free will in the first place, which is what ultimately allowed us to sin. He gave us that free will because he wanted us to follow him because we wanted to. But then we get into them asking him for a king, basically saying, we aren't going to follow you, so give us this human ruler that we'll be able to follow. So, God was like, okay, suit yourself. Gives them their first king, which was anointed by the prophet Samuel and the tribal elders. That was Saul. That didn't go very well for them. Saul was not a very well-balanced individual. I'd say it's safe to say he was probably outright insane. Based on the actual history we have of this period, he was basically no better than just some kind of warlord, basically, which a lot of people that called themselves kings at that time basically were in this time period. That didn't last too long. I don't know how long Saul's kingship lasted, but as bad as he was for Israel, God didn't leave them with Saul. We know that that's where we get David from. That was about 1000 BC by all estimates. Some people put that between the 11th and 12th centuries BC. Doesn't really matter. The point is, around this time is where we get David, he wasn't a perfect king, but by all accounts he was still a very good one, because for all of his faults, he still ultimately entrusted everything that he did to God. Even when he had the unfortunate instance of, the adultery he committed, all the other problems he had, he still ultimately turned his life to God and trusted what he was doing in God's hands. So this was a time where Israel was still very firmly under the guidance of God. This is also the period where we get a lot of the Psalms. We know that David wrote most of them, I believe. Some of those probably weren't him necessarily. They practiced something called pseudepigraphy back then, which is when someone writes something under someone else's name. Not the same as plagiarism. It was fully accepted back then. Let's see here. And David's reign lasted about 35, 36 years, give or take. Then, of course, we got Solomon, who wasn't an awful king either. The Bible even it shows him as being a very wise man, a very wise ruler. The problem, he started falling into the same problems that Israel had had all the times before, where he really started getting tempted into all these other cultural practices. I think he actually had a few hundred wives, which, of course, under God's law was not something you were supposed to do. Let's see here. So that's kind of where things started getting really out of hand for Israel after Solomon died. Have an unsteady hand when the king dies. The chances are his sons who took over for him were not going to fare much better. So at that point, Israel, which was about all this yellow spot right here, not down here, just around here, that was all united up until the time of Solomon's death. After he died, he had two sons, possibly more, but he had two that took over. Their names were Rehoboam and Jeroboam. I don't remember which one was which, but at this point we kind of see the kingdom broken in two. So you had the northern half here, which was 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were there. That was what was called Israel itself. And you had Judah in the south, which was where Jerusalem was. That's where the tribes of Benjamin and Judah were. I think it was also the tribe that was the tribe that David was descended from. It's a tribe that ultimately Jesus himself would descend from. So we have those two divided kingdoms at that point, which was a very long period of hardship for the Israelites. This is where we get a lot of the books of the prophets. Later in the Old Testament, that's where we get kind of the sequence breaks, because it does not tell those in order. Most of the prophets were from this period. A couple of them were a bit later. I'll get into that in a second. But basically, from about 900 some BC to about 590 to 80 BC, we have the period of the divided kingdom. You have a lot of really bad kings there that were even worse than all the ones we talked about at this point. There were a couple of good ones mixed in there, like in Isaiah we read about King Hezekiah, who he started off not great, but he kind of had a coming to God moment, and for the last part of his life he really turned things around for a while. Yes. Things didn't kind of go any better after him. Around 722 BC, the northern kingdom actually fell apart completely. It was conquered by the Assyrians, who were the people up around here. They were a very powerful kingdom at the time. They conquered the northern kingdom, took a lot of the people into captivity so they could settle it for themselves. And Israel never really got that land back. I don't think they even really have it today. I think that's where modern Syria is today. The worst part is since they were kind of always farther from God as a kingdom anyway, they kind of well integrated into their society, so that group of Israel were kind of lost irreparably at that point. But for a while longer than that, you had King Josiah about this period. He was the last good king that Israel ever had. Unfortunately, he died in battle. And just so I don't get ahead of myself, I'm just going to read off where some of the books of the Old Testament come into play here, because this is kind of where we lose everything going in the chronological order. So around 587 BC is where Judah falls. It gets conquered by the Babylonians, who are all around this area there. They spent about 50 years in exile too. They were forced to live in Babylon, live among Babylon. The temple was destroyed in this time. That's where we actually get a lot of the modern Jewish practices, because since they didn't want to lose their culture living among other people, since of course so much of their religion revolved around the temple itself, which they no longer had, that's where we get synagogues from. That's where a lot of the the Torah, the Jewish law and the early books of the Bible, that's where a lot of them are believed to have been written down during. Basically, whatever the Jews have as their, more regulated and widely understood traditions now came from this time period. Daniel and Ezekiel were written during this time when they were in exile. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, which are the last few books of the Old Testament, they were written after this period where Israel was allowed to reestablish itself. Babylon was taken out by Persia, which is was all this area here. They allowed Israel to go back and start rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem and everything. That's where the Old Testament kind of ends out. That's what Ezra and Nehemiah are talking about, all that process. Excuse me. And all these other books of the prophets that we have, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Lamentations, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. I know it's a whole lot, and they're kind of out of order. Those were written all before that period, where we had the Israelite kings still. Those were all called the pre-exiled prophets. A lot of them still were, starting to prophesy the coming of Jesus about 600 years later. And the rest of the books of the Old Testament, you have Proverbs, Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, and a couple others, I believe. Those are just what's called the wisdom writings. They don't necessarily have a story going on. They're just like other wisdom that we're supposed to get from that time. Job kind of has one. They don't really know where to date that one, and some people actually think it was more of a metaphor, that it didn't actually happen. I won't say that that's really wrong one way or another, but it's just what people think. That the book of Malachi, that's taking place at 400 BC, and you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, the New Testament, that's taking place at around the turn into the Common Era, the AD years. What happened in between? Well, after the book of Malachi, we actually have 400 years of the Bible not really telling us very much. That's 400 years of history transpiring outside of the Bible. Thankfully, by this point, we actually do have more written record of what's going on, because we have a lot more actual recorded history happening by now. A lot more of the larger empires that we know from history were starting to arise at this point. Rome was starting to come about this period. They weren't very big yet. But specifically, this is the more important one, actually. More important than Rome, even for this period, was Alexander the Great's empire, from Greece. Please tell me, are there any questions yet? Anything at all? Anything you want me to go back over? So I know I'm going very fast. Any confusion whatsoever? Did I lose anyone at any point? You can be honest. Is this all interesting, at least? But I know this is probably more academic than we've ever done in Surge before. I just felt it important that we kind of go through the context of the Bible, so that way you have more of a frame of reference for when we talk about these things in the future. Honestly, I'm probably going to focus more on the New Testament in our discussions anyway, but the Old Testament's still important, and really understanding how we get to the point of when Jesus came around and everything that he was doing. Very crucial to understanding why everything was important there, why everyone was even looking forward to a Messiah at that point. Any questions from the adults, actually?
I'm going to offer up something. I'm 64 years old, and I want to tell you something. Pastor Jeff has taught me an awful lot tonight. An awful lot. Some things I do know, some things I didn't know. And I think that we need to just continue to listen to what Jeff's got to say, and if you really feel that you don't know something and Jeff's kind of like sketched through it, don't be afraid to ask questions, because if you don't ask the question, you're going to go throughout life without having the answer. And what do they tell you?
Yeah,
if you don't ask the question,
someone else may have the same
you
question.
don't ask the question, guess what?
And I
stupid.
love answering questions.
Yeah. No.
I'm not even doing this to show off my knowledge, because I had a basic outline of all this stuff in my head when I woke up this morning, but I really wanted to do you guys the justice of giving you like the proper outline of everything that was happening. So I actually did a whole lot of research on this stuff today just to make sure that I had everything.
Great job, Jeff.
That I had
Great job.
everything right. I actually got to talk about a lot of this more recent history that I'm about to discuss right now in my classes recently. I actually kind of skipped doing a lot of my homework today to put this together, so I hope it's interesting. I'm sorry if it isn't, but you know, I know Nathan was asking for this last week, and I hope you'll be able. Please tell him I'm putting this on YouTube so he can watch it later.
It'll be on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
What?
Okay, the Surge Facebook page, it will get put on.
Oh, okay.
So that's all he'll have to do, okay?
But anyway, like I was saying, after the book of Malachi, which actually, just to help us appreciate the transition into the New Testament here, I want to read the last couple of verses from that. It's not a very long book, but the last book of the Old Testament that we have. Okay, here we go.
Oh, yeah. Chris was on Empire Court, right?
Now, obviously, I know I've probably talked about this before. You know, we call the Old Testament because obviously the New Testament came after, but, you know, the Old Testament existed not in its current form, obviously, but all the text of it existed before Jesus came around, before Christianity ever became a thing. Because before us, you know, it was the Hebrew Bible. You know, that's what it is to them, the Hebrew Bible, not the Old Testament. You know, it's old to us. Yeah, well, I shouldn't say old. There's still plenty of lessons to take from it, even though our faith really comes into play with the New Testament. But to them, it was, you know, it was just the Hebrew Bible. But despite that, you know, despite a lot of the Jewish people wouldn't go on to accept Jesus as the Messiah. You know, let me just read the last chapter of Malachi, because even though they weren't anticipating it leading into the next bit of Scripture, I think it really does. Surely the day is coming, it'll burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble, and that day that is coming will set them on fire, says the Lord Almighty. Not a root or a branch will be left to them. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go out and leap like calves released from a stall. Then you will trample down the wicked, and they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I do these things, says the Lord Almighty. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse. Now that's not foreshadowing about what's going to come 400 years later. I don't know what is, and I'm losing it right now. Tom, do you remember what Elijah translates to?
I'm not sure, Jeff.
I know
not sure. We could Google it, Jeff.
Yes,
Google
we
it.
can.
Just Google it. You got the computer. My God is Yahweh, or Greek from Elias, according to the books of Kings.
Okay, not exactly what I thought it was, but you see why everyone was kind of expecting the prophet Elijah that, you know, from, oh wait, no, this isn't the map I wanted. This is the map I wanted
I
either.
remember he never died.
Oh, right, here's where the map was. So yeah, this was the Persian Empire that overthrew the Babylonians. Babylonians were right here, so on and so forth.
Moses and Elijah.
So anyway, that's why people were asking when people were asking John the Baptist in the New Testament, you know, who is this Messiah that is coming? You know, is it Elijah? Who is it? You know, that's actually where that comes from, is what they were expecting from this verse. They knew a Messiah was coming, and based on what we're going to discuss right now, you know, we're going to see why they weren't exactly expecting a Messiah like Jesus, why they were expecting something else entirely. So around this time, we get the Empire of Alexander the Great, which of course started right around here where Greece is now. Alexander the Great probably came up with one of the largest empires that would probably ever exist in our time. So we see all of this right here. I don't think this red stuff was under his control. It might have been, I may be wrong about that. The light blue, I don't think he ever controlled Rome and Italy. But he controlled all of Greece, he controlled all of Egypt, all of what we know today as Turkey. He actually went as far as getting all the way to India at one point. It's actually kind of, if you go into Indian and Hinduism history, you actually kind of have a Greek influence in there, hidden about 2,000 years ago. Kind of interesting to read about, but yeah, that's how far he went. Alexander the Great didn't live very long, though. He died at the age of 33 of a very simple illness. And when he died, his empire fractured into several different pieces that ended up getting taken over by his generals. So you had basically a loose affiliation of Greek city-states here at the orange spot that broke off there. You know, that's where you have Athens, Sparta, and all that. You have what would become Macedon up here, Macedonia up here, basically just northern Greece. I think when he was alive, the empire was called the Macedonian Empire, so that was where he was actually from. Those aren't the two we're worried about here. The two we're worried about are the yellow and the green here. The green being Greek, what we call Hellenized, that's what we call Greek influenced, Hellenized Egypt under Ptolemy II, who kind of called himself a pharaoh. He was more of a Greek king. And the yellow here, which would form the early Seleucid Empire, who in the Bible, they kind of, in history at the time, they kind of called on the Assyrians as more of a general term. That was under a man named Antiochus the. Oh wait, no, that was later. That was later. My mistake. So when Alexander the Great was conquering everything, of course they took everything where Israel was. So they had actually defeated the Persians at the time, who I think Israel were kind of. They were kind of subservient to, but not really. The Persians were more interested in letting them do their own thing. So that was where Jewish beliefs were allowed to kind of resurface and rebuild themselves. The temple was rebuilt in this time. That's where we get the term Second Temple Judaism, which is what was around in Jesus' time. So for about how long was that? So it wouldn't have been directly under Greece for very long since Alexander died. Around the year 300 BC is where it was conquered basically by the ruler of Egypt at the time, Ptolemy II, Ptolemaic Egypt. That's where we get that name from. And it ruled like that for about 100 years. And you would think Israel being under the control of Egypt would actually be a really bad thing given their past. Honestly speaking, compared to what they went through in the years to come, it honestly wasn't that bad. They were allowed to do their own thing. It was a fairly prosperous period. There was the problem of Greek influence starting to kind of subvert Judaism a little bit. That was kind of like Greek culture did everywhere, even in the Romans, and we know what they would do throughout history. It's why we call it Greco-Roman culture, because even when the Romans basically conquered half the world, they were still basically operating under Greek religion. Most of the Roman gods are basically just renamed Greek gods, interestingly enough. But yeah, like a lot of the practices we get in the Old Testament in Israel kind of come from that culture. Like everyone that was literate would be reading in Greek. They would have spoken Aramaic, which was kind of a less formal Hebrew, but very few of the Jewish priesthood actually even spoke Hebrew, interestingly enough. It was more of a written thing, but even that, they didn't use that often because they still kept to the oral recitation of their scripture more often than not. So you just had Greek culture breaking into everything, which unfortunately had a lot of really bad things breaking into it. Unfortunately, pedophilia was a very big part of that. I won't get into that because that's some really nasty stuff that they did. And a lot of how that happened is because the Greeks had a system where their retired soldiers were given farmland in the areas they conquered, so they were able to retire there. And obviously then they'd integrate into the culture around them, so that's how they ended up kind of intermixing and everything. So it went on like that for about 100 years. That's when our good old friends, the Assyrians, decide to come back to Israel. This time under Antiochus IV, who was the leader of that area at the time. He was not a very nice guy. He was ruling over Israel for about 40 years or so until about 160 BC. He was a lot less friendly to Jewish culture. He kind of didn't want that to keep going, so he actively punished the Jews for like practicing the Sabbath, where they wouldn't work on the seventh day of the week on their holy day, which for us is Saturday instead of Sunday. Interestingly enough, they didn't like it when they were they kept to their food laws, not eating certain things. They actually forced them to eat pork, which was one of the worst things you could do to a Jew at the time. Especially seeing as how one of the reasons that the Jews didn't eat pork was because at the time they couldn't cook it properly. So, you risk severe trichinosis, which in those times would definitely have killed you. That lasted for about 40 years until you get to what's called the Hasmonean period of Israel. I'm sorry for all these names. I really wish I didn't have to. And this kind of actually is talked about in the Bible, but only the Catholic one. Because the Catholic Bibles have what's called the Apocrypha written in it, which for a long time was actually included in the Bible. You have a few books in there that we don't include nowadays. 1st through 3rd Maccabees, Judith, a few others. I don't remember all of them. Reason for that was because the Jewish people around 70 AD, that's when, after they lost Israel altogether, that's when they actually decided to compile the Old Testament as we know it to really preserve it. Since at that point the Jews were so dispersed across the Mediterranean world, that's what we call all that area, all those countries around Rome and Greece that are around the Mediterranean Sea and Europe and Asia. They were so dispersed throughout that, they didn't want them to lose all their culture, so that's when they compiled that, what's called the Council of Yamnia. Don't bother remembering that name. You would only need that if you were in college or something and you were deliberately studying this. But obviously that collection didn't necessarily get around to everyone, because what Christians ended up using as the Old Testament did not originate from what the Jews came up with, but rather what a small group of Jews developed in Alexandria, which was a largely Jewish populated city in Egypt. They compiled what's called the Septuagint in, I think, 200 AD, I believe. That was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. They didn't realize that some of the books that had been considered scripture before were removed 100 years before. So Christians actually came up with our Bible about 150 years after that. And we, of course, took our Old Testament from what they came up with. So for about 1,500 years, we actually didn't realize that shouldn't be in there. Then, of course, when the Reformation happened, Martin Luther saw that in his own study of the Bible. And he said, well, the Old Testament is the Jewish Bible. I'll take their word on it for what should be scripture in there. So he removed what the Catholics had put in there. The Catholics actually have the Old Testament in a different order than we or the Jews do. So actually we have it in a different order than the Jews too. That's a whole nother story, but that's how we have that. But anyway, Hasmonean Israel, that was basically just about an 80-year period where the Jews ruled over themselves again. Sounds all well and good. That didn't really work any better because that was still very Greek influenced. It was a very fractured time. And the reason they were even able to beat the Assyrians is because they had Roman assistance, which at that time is like making a deal with the devil. And of course, due to the fractured nature of everything, the Romans didn't exactly take kindly to their self-rule. So you get around 60 BC, we're getting very close to New Testament times here. Romans had about enough, so they just marched in all at once, took Israel for themselves. So that's where we end up having the Roman occupied Israel in the time of the New Testament. Let's see here. All that. All right, and of course, 60 BC, the next jump from there is basically just to the New Testament. Jesus being born about between 6 and 4 BC, and then him being crucified in 33 AD, give or take. So of course, the context to be looking at in the New Testament there, you have that Greek cultural influence that was defining a lot of what Israel was like at the time. You have Israel being under indirect Roman control. When they took over, they didn't take direct control of Rome. What they did is they instituted what's called a puppet king, which is where we get Herod the Great from. He was put in charge of Israel. Specifically, he was a bit of a cultural mess. No one liked Herod because he was he was part Assyrian, part Jewish, and part Greek. So basically, he was enough that they could agree to put him in charge, but he was enough of everything that everyone really hated him. And that kind of showed in the paranoia he had. There was actually a saying that went around, it was safer to be a pig of belonging to Herod than it was to be one of his sons. He was so paranoid, I think he killed 2 of his sons and 1 of his nephews because he was absolutely convinced that they were trying to kill him. So Herod the Great was also the guy that was in charge when Jesus was born. He was the one that ordered all of the infants to be killed in Bethlehem after Jesus was born, to try and get rid of them. That's why Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fled to Egypt for a few years until he died, which very shortly after that, he was surprisingly old despite how many STDs he had. Now, I know that sounds mean, but that man was very obviously riddled with syphilis with how his mental state was. That's something most scholars agree to. The man was absolutely insane. Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' birth was Octavian Caesar Augustus. It's not really important. There was a different emperor when Jesus died. That was Tiberius Caesar. I'm just telling you this just so you have those names so that you know it's 2 different emperors. And something else to really consider here, why did the Jews want a Messiah to come? What was that Messiah supposed to be? And based on the different accounts of the prophets, people had a lot of different ideas of what the Messiah was supposed to be, what the Messiah was supposed to do. One of the common opinions of what he was supposed to do was to finally kick all these foreigners out of Israel so that they could finally have their kingdom back. Some people thought it basically was going to be the ushering in of the end times, where the kingdom of God was finally brought down to earth and, all the kingdoms of men were going to be overturned and given back into the direct control of God. But a whole bunch of different things. You had a whole bunch of different groups of Jews in Israel at the time. You had the Pharisees, who actually technically were not the enemies of Jesus that we read about. That would have actually been the Sadducees. The Pharisees were basically the religious leaders in all the villages and the small towns in Israel. The Sadducees were the people in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. They were the ones that actually had Jesus killed. The Pharisees actually kind of had a lot in common with Jesus. They had most of the social influences in common. They were both from the same kinds of places. They actually had the same kind of influences. Even though they were questioning Jesus a lot and they were kind of hypocritical at times, they did kind of have the best interests at heart for the Jewish people. The Sadducees did not. They liked the fact that the power balance was in their control. They liked the fact that they were basically collaborators with the Roman government. The reason they hated Jesus was because Jesus was kind of overturning that power balance. He was threatening their position in society, was going to make them irrelevant. That's why they ultimately had him killed. It's kind of why the Romans had him killed too. Like we read that Pilate, when he was going to have Jesus crucified, you could tell he really didn't want to do it because he didn't really have a reason to. But if he didn't, the Sadducees were basically threatening to have a revolt. If that happened, Pilate was basically going to be killed by the Roman government because they did not like having uprisings in their territory. Uprisings meant they weren't collecting taxes. No taxes means no money for them. So that's basically where we get the whole justification behind the crucifixion. And in there's a whole lot more behind that. I can't stress that enough. There's a whole lot more depth to that. That's about the most basic description I can give you. Actually, yeah, that's basically all I have. I just went through about 2,000 years of history in about an hour. I am so sorry if that bored any of you. That very dense stuff, and I had to even glaze over a lot of that. Please tell me, are there any questions? even just like minor questions of interest, just like anything that you'd like to know more about or have anything cleared up.
Or if you have something on your mind.
Well, I was saying to Tommy, I didn't know Alexander was before the Romans.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep,
he,
yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
the
I
guts
thought
of his empire is
Oh, yeah.
actually how the Romans were able to kind of come in anyway. You know,
Right.
it wasn't hard because the cultural influence was already there.
Well, I took a Egypt class back in junior high, so I got a bit of this at Forward Junior High.
Yeah, I always had that stuff backwards too.
And the teacher was,
This is
he-
basically all stuff that I got in the past couple
Yeah.
of weeks. 'Cause I was really iffy about those 400 years that the Bible doesn't cover.
but I was surprised he never mentioned that. He did mention Jesus at that one point, which back in school times, but it was a public school, so.
Actually, let me rephrase the question. What did any of you learn? Let's see what you remembered here. I could wait here all night.
Probably can.
Yeah, he had a lot of coffee already.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I was talking too fast. I had a lot of caffeine with it very recently.
Coffee?
Yes,
The one that Chris gave you as your plate soccer?
yes.
Yeah, it was my fault.
And it was extra caffeinated too, so I'm gonna be up a while. Well, come on here. I know someone probably remembers something here that they learned. Or what's something you found interesting? I know this is probably somewhat boring for a lot of
The whole
you.
entire thing.
Huh?
The whole entire thing was interesting. Like at times I was like on point, like I was just into it. But then you got that side of me where I was just like.
Believe me, I get it. Like, this stuff throws me off sometimes, and I'm in graduate school right now, and I find all this confusing because there's so much depth to it. Now, just to make sure I'm not again assuming what you guys want, I know one of the things we brought up last week about what to talk about in the future. Something that was brought up was talking about where all the branches of Christianity comes from and where we get all the denominations. I can basically do something like this again, going through the last 2,000 years of church history. I promise I could keep that brief, but is that something that you guys want to see like next week or in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
PowerPoint.
That actually makes me really good. I'm very glad that this didn't bore you guys to tears. I was really worried about that when I was putting this together earlier. I could have put together a PowerPoint, make it more visual for you, but I was telling myself I will never subject these kids to a PowerPoint because I'm not just going to make this school for you guys. But I also really wanted to,
Books.
and I hope this was clear, I was really trying to emphasize
Page 7.
I was really trying to emphasize where God was in all of these events here, what God was doing, like the relationship between the Israelites and God at all these different points. Did I make that clear? Like, is that something that was like present enough in what I was talking about?
You know what, Jeff? I will say this.
I know I did it probably better earlier on. It was kind of hard to a bit later, especially once we get into the post-Malachi stuff. But
Think about what Jeff's going over tonight. You know what, too? Predicated on everything we know today, focus is on Israel. That's the focus. Think about it.
yeah, actually,
If you know about anything about the book of Revelation,
I'm actually
focal.
I'm thinking I'm probably going to
Israel.
have Ellie Quick come in here at some point and talk about those prophecies. She loves talking about this, how we have a lot of the prophecies of what's supposed to usher in the end times. And one of the biggest indicators of that is when Israel is given back to the Jews, which we know Israel is in existence now. It actually came back into being 1948 following World War II. That's about, 72 years ago now.
Yep.
So, the end times is not necessarily something that's talked about, as being, okay, this is happening, so everything's going to happen immediately after that. But that is one of the signs to look out for. I might not have her come in here, 'cause she might scare all of y'all.
Yeah, she could. I had her for a
Just tell her
teacher.
not to.
But actually, for next
She
week,
can scare me if she wants.
but before next week, in talking about that church history, was there anything specific in like where the denominations come from, where the branches of Christianity come from, that you guys specifically wanted to talk about? Because I have a lot of knowledge about that stuff. There's a lot of depth we could go into on a lot of that stuff. But was there anything specific with all of that that you guys wanted to touch on just for your own use? Like maybe like the origins of Methodism, you know, the Reformation of, you know, where all the non-Catholic stuff came from. Anything specific at all? Y'all are making me wish Nathan was here. He would tell me. Well, I know y'all have some preference of what you would want to talk about for that. I can go through all 2,000 years of church history. Don't think I won't, but like, is there anything particular in there you want me to highlight? I definitely have more knowledge of some things than others, that goes without saying, but Stephen, do you have any preferences? Yes, you do. All right, you're forcing me to do something I wouldn't do anyway. Tom, what would you think they benefit most from?
Maybe the
Well,
relationship of Jesus.
What's that?
If you don't tell me what you would benefit most from, I'll ask someone else.
Think about it. What Jeff just did, now he focused on the Old Testament, but think about it. The New Testament is an extension of the Old Testament. And really, Christianity is really, it's a Hebrew religion, only when Jesus was born, lived, died, resurrected.
Right, and talking about that, I definitely want to talk about the earliest in church history, because I think there's a lot of the biggest lessons of what we need to be doing as churches nowadays is in what the churches of, you know, the first couple centuries were doing, the things they had to deal with, because we look at the worst of the persecution that the church anywhere in the world is facing right now, like let's say like parts of Africa, North Korea, where you're literally publicly executed in the worst way imaginable just for being a Christian.
China.
And you look at what the Romans in the 3rd century were doing to Christians during the age of martyrdom. And oh my God, if that's not a lesson of what true faith is, I don't know what is. And I will get into that next week.
But you know, bottom line, Jeff, think about it. You know, really, Christianity is an extension of Judaism. That's what this is. I mean, the New Testament with the, you know, as I say, the birth of Jesus, we now live in the age of grace, the new covenant. But you think about it, you know, this is really, our faith is really predicated on Hebrew tenets.
All right, so this was one of the big things I'm going to go over next week. This is a precursor I'm going to talk about. You know, Nathan specifically asked for the branches of Christianity. That's technically not denominations. There's 3 branches of Christianity. There's what we are. We're under the Protestant branch, which is basically everything that's formed since the 1500s when, you know, you start having all these break-offs from the Catholic Church. But then we have this even bigger split here, the schism of 1054. Before that, you only had the Catholic Church. Then you had this west-east division between the Catholics and the Orthodox. I'm guessing most of you probably never even heard of the Orthodox Church. They do exist. They've been the same for the past 1,000 years. I mean, I'm not even joking about that. They've been doing the same services every week for every holy day for the past 1,000 years. And they don't do them in English. Even the Catholics do those now. They do their services in English for the most part. The Orthodox do not. They do theirs in Greek, Russian, whatever country they're in, they do it that specifically like that. So that's why we have Greek Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox churches, so on from there. I'll cover that more next week. But then, of course, you have 1517. That's where Protestantism comes in. Methodism itself, of course, coming from John Wesley, who came out of the Anglican Church, which was, you know, where Protestantism was forming in England. That was in the 1700s that he was living where that happened. I really think that was a true evangelical movement there. I'll get more into that next week. Please tell me any questions at all, please. I love answering questions. You're breaking my heart here.
Could we learn more of the man, Jesus?
Absolutely, yes.
That way,
these 2 weeks,
you
I've really
will-
just been wanting to use
you
to
will
get the,
have
Yes.
you can see how we have a relationship with him
yes.
now, and what he went through as a young boy, as a man.
Actually, that's an interesting thing I can go over, especially with some of the stuff I'm going over for the next couple months in my one class, is I can go through the 4 Gospels that we have of Jesus and show what each of those are specifically trying to tell us about. I mean, they all give us the same basic story, but they very clearly all have a specific lens that we're trying to look at them through.
Right.
Would that be of interest to you guys?
Yeah.
There's a whole lot to learn there. I'm not getting an audible yes here.
Yes.
Yes.
Adults.
I need them to tell me, Patty. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Come on, girl.
If you want to be here, that's perfectly fine
Andrea,
too.
speak up, come on, say yes.
Oh, there we go. I was going to ask her something. Oh, well.
Women United.
So y'all feel like you learned a good bit tonight? Am I doing a good job?
Yes.
Yes.
Amen.
Do I deserve this job?
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
You better believe you do.
Well, I
That
spent
might
3
be
hours
useful in
coming
your
up with all that. I don't want to
actual
do that
It's just
again. I
gonna
barely
serve the world
slept
history.
last night. And I was still doing that all today.
Think about it. You know what? I'm going to make another comment, and I don't want to get political, but think about it. One of the things that is evolving in our country and our world, there's a lot of incidents now of trying to destroy history. And I'll tell you what. If that happens, then we can really be very, very, very concerned and alerted to the fact that one of the things that Marxism and socialism, communism really are after is destroying history. And you know they want to really I think obstruct any avenue you might have to learning about our American history.
Actually, I'm glad you bring that up. Because over the past 300 years, ever since the Enlightenment period came, where people started getting obsessed with the power of human reason and intellect, people for the past couple hundred years have been trying to, they've been trying to study the Bible to try and prove that the things we have in it aren't as it's written, to prove that it's not historical, that it didn't happen as we read it. But more and more, as more historical study and archaeology is being done, there's actually more and more evidence to suggest that it actually is closer to how we read it. Or at the very least, we're starting to study the Bible in a way that even if it's technically not always chronologically accurate, or it's not always trying to be the most reliable, play-by-play of history, they're studying in a way that's proving that wasn't what it was even trying to be. They're reading it more now in a lens of what it's trying to say about Jesus, that tells us about history, what it tells us about what Jesus was, what Jesus was doing in society. More importantly, what that meant in the culture at the time and how him coming around completely started overturning things. Because the fact that he 2,000 years ago, before we even had the ideas of democracy ever conceived of, talking about how we're all equal, how we should all live together and, as one body, being completely equal, loving one another, not basically being ruled over by divisions of ethnicity, race, social class, anything like that, or dividing ourselves even under earthly kingdoms. The fact that 2,000 years ago he was suggesting what even today is kind of a revolutionary thought.
Yes.
You think about that in the context of what they had back then, oh my God, if that wasn't from God itself, what could it possibly be? So if no one else has any questions, comments you'd like to bring up, or anything of interest, anything that interested you, no? All right, well, here's an even harder question. Who wants to pray us out? This is the real youth leader experience. Never having anyone volunteer. Don't make me volunteer someone. James, you do it.
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for letting us all gather today and get here safely so we can see everyone, enjoy an hour free time, and enjoy an hour lesson of learning more about you, God. We thank you for letting us knowing about the Word of Christ and having people teach us about this in our lives. People who haven't even learned about this have learned about it today and started believing in it because of all the pastors and preachers out there who've been teaching the Word of the Lord. Please let everybody here who is dealing with any trouble or has a family member that is hurt, please help them get healed with all of your heart. And please let everybody get home safely tonight and let them wake up another morning. Amen.
Amen.
Very good.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a hard.
Sorry, I held you.